Hi, Mr. Corsey here. Now, before discussing the glider gun and its behaviour, I'm going to put its discovery into a bit of context. What led up to its discovery in 1970? Why was its discovery important? In 1968, John Conway was a young mathematics lecturer at Cambridge University, and for reasons we'll talk about shortly, he was interested in cellular automata, and he was exploring different rules before he finally settled on the game of life rules. So here are the rules that he finally settled on. B3. That's a birth that occurs in a cell that's exactly surrounded by 3 neighbours. And S23, a piece survives if it's surrounded by exactly 2 or 3 neighbours. That's Conway's game of life rules. Now we're going to explore alternatives to these rules, and we're going to use the R-Pentomino. There it is. It's a configuration of 5 cells. And the first rule we're going to explore is a change in the birth rule, where a birth occurs in an empty cell that's surrounded by exactly 2 neighbours, so B2, and we'll keep the survival rule to 2 and 3 neighbours. So let's get going and see what happens. Now you can see pretty quickly that's just going to keep expanding, and it does, it keeps expanding forever. Let's change to B4 S23. So now a birth will take place in an empty cell surrounded by exactly 4 neighbours, and we'll leave the survival rules the same. So let's start this, see what happens. Well, there it is. After only 1 generation, it achieved a stable state. And here's a final exploration where we'll keep the birth as in Conway's rules, 3, and survival we've moved to 3-4 instead of 2-3. And again we'll start with the R-Pentomino, so let's set that go and see what happens. We get a curious oscillator, 16 generations, and it repeats itself. So let's return now to Conway's rules, B3S23. Now Conway was interested in finding rules that produced lots of variety and unpredictable results, with delicate balance between life and death, so that the patterns would not grow explosively, nor would they always lead to collapse. The R-Pentomino was one of the configurations Conway and his group at Cambridge University was exploring in late summer 1970. So let's watch now how it behaves. Well, already you can see that there's certainly a great deal of variety and unpredictability in what we're seeing. Let's freeze it there for a minute, because you may have noticed there emerges a glider, and this is the most famous glider in the history of the game of life. This is generation 69, 69 ticks of the clock, and was the first glider ever observed. Conway and his group of graduates were exploring this pattern in 1970, and it was Richard Guy who first noticed the glider configuration. They were not using computers, but had to rely on checker counters and boards and physically keep track of all the activity, which is no easy task. And Richard Guy was assigned the task of keeping track of the resulting debris produced by all the activity in the R-Pentomino configuration. He was called by Conway the blinker watcher. So let's continue watching the R-Pentomino develop. So there you can see the glider passing by 3 blocks, and you'll notice another glider going southeast. That's 2 gliders, and another one going southeast at the bottom. That's 3 gliders so far. And here's the 4th one, also going southeast. So 3 going down southeast, 1 going up northeast, and here's a 5th one going northwest. So let's now speed up the activity somewhat because it's still developing. And we'll carefully watch for any more gliders. There's one. Quickly disappeared. It went northwest. And finally, activity has ceased. And here's the final tally after 1,103 generations. We've got 8 blocks, 6 gliders, 4 beehives, 4 blinkers, 1 boat, 1 loaf, and 1 ship. Certainly a vast variety of debris there. It was the appearance of gliders that convinced Conway to continue exploring his game of life world. So what was he attempting to achieve? He'd been inspired by work that John von Neumann had done in the 1940s. It was published posthumously in 1966 and inspired John Conway. And this explored the use of cellular automata for the purpose of building a machine that would self-reproduce. Now, von Neumann's rules had 29 different states, as opposed to Conway's having 2 states, either alive or dead. And Conway felt that he could do what von Neumann had done, but with this very much simpler cellular automata. One feature that he knew he needed was the ability to move information around from place to place. Now, gliders, or more precisely streams of gliders, could serve this purpose. Suppose the presence of a glider represented 1, and suppose the absence of a glider represented 0. But what would produce these streams of gliders? Well, that's when Conway decided to go public. He sent a letter about his discoveries so far in the game of life to Martin Gardiner, who then devoted one of his monthly mathematical games columns in Scientific American entirely to the topic. And in that article he set a challenge for readers of that article. So this challenge was taken up by a group of young computer programmers, or hackers as they were called at the time. They were working at MIT in Marvin Minsky's artificial intelligence lab, and they had the luxury of access to a PDP-6 computer, which incidentally had cost Marvin Minsky's lab $1 million. You can see the computer in its porthole display in the picture. In particular, one of the group, Bill Gosper, got hooked with the game of life, and he worked obsessively searching for a glider gun in the next few weeks. So what was his approach? What was his strategy? To understand what he did, let's return to the R-Pentomino and look at generation 775, in particular this pattern that looks like a right-pointing arrowhead. Let's follow the progress to generation 790. That's 15 generations later. And there's the same arrowhead pointing to the left. And then it rapidly gets destroyed. Now, Conway's group didn't notice it, but Bill Gosper did. And it was this pattern that he investigated. So let's now watch how it progresses on its own. So it moves to the right. It creates a beehive, moves then to the left. Creates another beehive, which is why it's called a queen bee. But unfortunately, when it moves back to the right, the beehive on the right then destroys it. And eventually it stabilises, but many generations later. Now, you wonder if there's any way that that beehive could be prevented from destroying it. Now, let's put a block just on the right and watch what happens. The queen bee comes up, deposits its beehive, which then is destroyed by the block, and the block is preserved. It does the same again on the left, but there's no block on the left. Here it comes back to the right, the beehive's destroyed by the block is preserved, but of course the beehive on the left now destroys the queen bee. And there we go, eventually grows large and stabilises eventually. So let's put a block in the right place on the left, and now watch what happens. Queen bee moves to the right, beehive is destroyed. Moves to the left, the beehive is destroyed. Moves to the right, beehive is destroyed, and so on. We've now got an oscillator, perfectly functioning oscillator. It's called the Queen Bee Shuttle, and it repeats every 30 generations. It's a period 30 oscillator. So this 30 generation oscillator was the essential ingredient that Gosper used to create the glider gun. And what he decided to do was to point two Queen Bee shuttles at each other. But the one on the left, he removed the block on the right, and the one on the right, he removed the block on the left so that they could interfere with each other. And his plan, he was hoping that the interference would bounce them off each other, but the mess that was left might produce a glider and then disappear. There's all sorts of different ways these could be arranged. He worked out there were 200 to 300 different ways, either in phase or out of phase, moving them closer, moving them further away. So let's do an experiment that he might well have done. Here's the first one, two Queen Bee shuttles with the protective blocks removed. Let's start this off and see what happens. So here they come towards each other, and they bounce off each other, but there's no debris left in the middle to produce a glider. So there's a failed experiment. Let's try a second one. They're now out of phase. Let's start them off and see what happens. So they come towards each other. The one on the left seems to be working fine, but look at the one on the right. It's not functioning properly. In fact, it's going out of control. Well, it's stabilised into a block, and it leaves one queen bee working away on the left, but of course we know that that beehive's then going to destroy it. So there's another failed experiment where one queen bee survived and the other one was destroyed, and then eventually the one that survived was also destroyed. So here's a third experiment, again out of phase but moved slightly down the one on the right. The two queen bees meet each other. There's a bit of a mess in the middle. The queen bee on the right survived, but then was destroyed by that block. But look, there's a glider born, but neither queen bee has survived the experience. They've both disappeared, leaving one glider gradually moving off screen to the northwest, and there the rest of the configuration stabilised. So that's a third experiment that failed. So here's the final arrangement that Gosper discovered. Two Queen Bee shuttles course, their blocks have been removed. The one on the left has its right block removed. The one on the right has its left block removed. The one on the left has just laid a beehive. The one on the right is about to lay a beehive. So let's watch this pattern develop. So here's the two queen bees approaching each other. There's certainly a good bit of reaction, and they've both bounced off but left debris in the middle. And there's the first glider produced, and it just misses the queen bee as it returns to the centre. More debris left in the middle. There's a new glider formed. Meanwhile, the two queen bees are laying their beehives, and the blocks are destroying them. Beautiful arrangement. You can imagine Gosper's excitement when he was staring at this wee porthole screen in the computer, observing this glider gun producing all these gliders, knowing that he'd won John Conway's challenge of $50, which is about £250 in today's money. Gosper immediately sent a telegram to Martin Gardiner announcing his discovery. Here's the telegram he sent, and it's dated the 15th of November 1970. And in it he describes the glider gun using coordinate pairs for each live cell on the grid. Presumably when Martin Gardiner received it, he had no way of verifying it. He didn't have the equipment, and so he didn't know if it was correct or not. So he wrote on it, "I hope he's right," sent it on to John Conway. And presumably then John Conway checked it, but you'll notice he queried one pair of coordinates, circling the 17-1 pair and suggesting it should have been 17-1 instead. And you'll notice that Gosper repeated the set of coordinates in case of errors, but the same 17-1 also appears in the second list. So let's investigate this. Let's plot these coordinates exactly as Conway would have done and see what happens. So let's set up our x and y axis and start plotting. Here's 26.2, 25.3, 26.3, -8, 0, -8, 1, -9, 1, and so on. Now let's watch out for this possible mistake, which is just coming up. There it is, 17-1. And now that we've plotted it, let's check whether it works or not. Well, the left-hand side looks okay, but the right-hand side is a mess. So there definitely was a mistake in that list. So let's correct it the way John Conway corrected it and move that 17-1 up to the 17-1 position, and let's check how this works. This is immediately looking much better. Two queen bees are interacting in the middle, bit of debris, and there's the first glider. Now you'll notice it's orientated 180 degrees round from our initial discovery or demonstration of it. So the gliders are going north-west. It brings to mind that there are 4 orientations of this glider gun. So let's celebrate finally by putting 4 glider guns together in their different orientations, and let's start this off and watch the proceedings. it's Mr. Corsi signing out, and hope you enjoyed the video.